A talented musician, humiliated in a luxury bar by a wealthy stranger, finds himself at a crossroads, whether to abandon his passion or rise above the cruelty. As Marcus fights to reclaim his dignity, the same woman returns, seeking forgiveness. But can Marcus trust her change of heart, or is this all part of a new game? A heartfelt story of resilience, redemption, and the power of music to heal old wounds. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The night was dark and stormy, with rain pounding on the windows of the upscale bar. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. The warmth of chandeliers lit up the polished wood floors, reflecting off the glass surfaces of the tables where the city's wealthy elite lounged with expensive drinks in hand. The establishment was known for its exclusivity, a place where the upper crust came to enjoy fine music, gourmet cuisine, and a taste of superiority. Marcus sat in the corner of the stage, his saxophone resting lightly on his knee. His fingers were poised, ready to play. To Marcus, this instrument wasn't just a tool. It was his voice. His heart had spoken through it ever since he was a child, pouring out his soul in a language that words could never fully express. Music was his lifeline, his identity. Tonight, though, the room felt colder than usual. The patrons at this bar never truly listened. They might hear his notes in the background while they sipped on their cocktails, but their attention was always elsewhere, on themselves, their money, and their status. The first soft note floated through the air, a melody full of longing and history. Marcus's eyes were closed, allowing the music to take him somewhere else, somewhere far from this place, somewhere he could forget the weight of judgment that came with every glance directed his way. But not everyone in the bar was ignoring him. At a table not far from the stage sat a group of 4 women, dressed in designer clothes that screamed wealth and privilege. Among them was Claudia, the self-proclaimed leader of the group. She was known for her biting wit and sharp tongue, a woman who used her wealth to assert dominance over everyone around her. Her carefully styled blonde hair and perfectly manicured nails contrasted sharply with the casual cruelty that often laced her words. Tonight, her target was Marcus. "Look at him," Claudia whispered to her friends, loud enough that Marcus could hear through the music, playing his little heart out like anyone actually cares. The women giggled. Claudia's eyes sparkled with mischief as she continued, her voice rising above the soft music. "You'd think he'd be playing in some smoky bar downtown, not here. Who let him in?" One of her friends tried to shush her, glancing around to see if anyone was paying attention, but Claudia was relentless. She leaned back in her chair, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. "What's he even doing here? You'd think he could afford a decent suit by now. Do you think he even understands half the words on the menu?" The mockery stung, but Marcus kept playing. He had learned long ago how to bury his emotions deep inside, using his music as a shield. The notes became more intense, a quiet defiance hidden within the melody. But Claudia wasn't done. With a flourish, she pulled out a crisp bill from her wallet, waving it in the air as if it were some kind of joke. "Hey, you!" she called out to Marcus. "How much do you make in an hour? This should cover it." She tossed the money toward the stage, the bill fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. Her friends burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the room. Marcus's fingers faltered for just a moment, his heart heavy with the sting of humiliation. He paused, the music abruptly cutting off as the room fell into an awkward silence. All eyes were on him now. The patrons who had been ignoring him were suddenly curious, their gazes shifting between Marcus and Claudia's table. But Marcus didn't respond. He didn't look at Claudia or the money lying on the floor. Instead, he placed his saxophone down gently, stood up, and walked off the stage. His face was expressionless, but inside, a storm was raging. He wasn't going to give Claudia or her friends the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He wouldn't let them know just how deeply their words had cut him. The bar manager rushed over, trying to smooth things over, but Marcus waved him off. He didn't need any more attention, didn't want to make a scene. With his instrument case in hand, Marcus walked out of the bar, leaving behind the warmth, the laughter, and the cruelty. Outside, the rain had picked up, pouring down in heavy sheets. It soaked through his thin jacket within minutes, but Marcus barely noticed. He walked through the empty streets, each step heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Humiliation had a way of settling deep in the bones, and tonight Marcus felt it in every fiber of his being. Claudia's taunts had been about more than just his music. They were about who he was, his background, his skin color, the very essence of his identity. She had reduced him to nothing more than a source of amusement, a spectacle for the rich and entitled to laugh at. The rain blurred the city lights as Marcus walked, his mind replaying the scene over and over. He had played in countless venues, from dingy clubs to elegant bars like this one, but never before had he felt so small. He had always believed that his music could speak for him, that it would be enough to bridge the gap between him and those who looked down on him. But tonight, it hadn't been enough. He stopped at the corner of a street, standing beneath the dim light of a street lamp. The rain continued to pour, but Marcus didn't care. His heart was heavy, but deep within, a flicker of determination remained. He would not let this break him. He would not give Claudia the satisfaction of thinking she had won. With a deep breath, Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket and called the only person who could always make sense of the world when it seemed to be falling apart, his mentor, James. The phone rang once, twice, before the familiar voice picked up on the other end. "Marcus?" James's voice was warm, calm, and instantly comforting. "What's going on, son?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, feeling the sting of emotion in his throat. "I need to talk. Can I come by?" "Of course," James replied without hesitation. "Come on over." Marcus hung up the phone and began walking toward James's house. The rain showed no signs of stopping, but Marcus didn't mind. He needed the walk, needed the time to gather his thoughts before he faced his mentor. Tonight had shaken him to his core, but there was still a part of him that believed in his music, in himself. And no matter what, he wasn't going to let Claudia take that away from him. As he walked through the rain, Marcus made a promise to himself. He would rise above this. He had faced prejudice before, and he would face it again. But through it all, he would keep playing. Because his music was more than just notes and rhythms. It was his soul. And no one, not even Claudia, could take that away. The rain had let up by the time Marcus arrived at James's modest home, though his clothes were still soaked through from the earlier downpour. The streets were quiet now, only the soft patter of water dripping from rooftops and the distant hum of traffic filling the air. Marcus stood for a moment on the porch, staring at the door, trying to find the right words to explain the storm of emotions inside him. He wasn't sure he could. Before he could knock, the door opened. James stood there, a tall man with graying hair and kind, tired eyes. He had lived through more than his share of hardships, but his spirit was unbroken. He'd once been a renowned jazz musician himself, his name well known in the circles Marcus now played in. But James had chosen a simpler life in his later years, teaching music to young, hopeful artists like Marcus, and offering them more than just lessons on scales and melodies. He offered them life lessons, wisdom drawn from years of navigating the world as both a black man and a musician. "Come on in, son," James said gently, stepping aside to let Marcus inside. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the coldness that still clung to Marcus's skin. The smell of brewing coffee filled the air, and the soft strains of a jazz record played in the background, as it always did at James's place. Marcus shrugged off his wet jacket and placed his saxophone case by the door before sinking into the worn but comfortable armchair that had become a second home to him over the years. For a long moment, he said nothing, just sat there with his head resting in his hands, the weight of the night pressing down on him. James, ever patient, sat across from him with his hands folded on his lap, waiting. He knew Marcus would speak when he was ready. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus let out a heavy sigh. "It happened again," he murmured, his voice low and strained. Tonight at the bar. James didn't need to ask what it was. He had been where Marcus was countless times before, in a world where talent wasn't enough to shield you from the prejudices of those who looked down on you because of your skin color or your background. He knew the sting of those moments, how they could make you question everything, your worth, your place in the world, your right to exist in certain spaces. "Tell me what happened," James said quietly, though he could already guess. Marcus stared down at his hands, his fingers tracing invisible lines on the surface of his pants. I was playing, like usual. The crowd wasn't really paying attention. Nothing new there. But then, this woman, she started making comments. You know the kind. Rich, entitled, like I was there just for her amusement. James nodded, his face unreadable but his eyes filled with empathy. She called me out in front of everyone, Marcus continued, his voice shaking slightly. Threw money at me like I was some street performer begging for change. And I couldn't say anything. I couldn't even finish my set. I just walked out. There was a long silence. Marcus hadn't realized until now how much the moment had weighed on him. His chest felt tight, his throat raw from holding back the emotions that had been bubbling up since he left the bar. But here, in the safety of James's home, the floodgates opened. I've been through this before, you know? Marcus's voice rose, frustration and pain intermingling. I've dealt with the looks, the comments, the people who think I don't belong in their world. But tonight, it just felt different. Like no matter how hard I work, no matter how much I improve, people like her will always see me as nothing. James sighed softly, leaning back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests. I understand, he said, his voice calm but weighted with years of experience. I've been in your shoes more times than I care to remember. And I know it hurts, Marcus. It cuts deep. Marcus nodded, biting his lip as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. I don't know if I can do this anymore, James. What's the point? I'll never be good enough for people like her. And even if I am, they won't see it. They'll never see me. James watched him carefully, considering his words before responding. You're right about one thing, Marcus. People like her may never see you. Not truly. They may never understand the depth of your talent or the beauty of your music. But that's not why you play, is it? Marcus looked up, frowning. What do you mean? You don't play for people like her, James said, his voice firm but gentle. You never have. You play because it's who you are. It's in your blood, in your bones. The music, it's yours. It belongs to you, not to them. And whether they see you or not doesn't change that. But it still hurts, Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. It hurts to be treated like I'm invisible, like I'm not worth anything. James nodded, understanding. Of course it hurts. You'd be lying if you said it didn't. But the pain doesn't define you. Your music does. And right now, you're letting people like her take that away from you. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat, his emotions warring inside him. He wanted to fight back, to shout that it wasn't fair, that he deserved to be treated with respect. But at the same time, he knew James was right. His music had always been his anchor, the one thing that kept him grounded in a world that often seemed determined to push him down. And now, for the first time, he was letting someone else take that away from him. I don't know how to keep going, Marcus admitted, his voice small. Every time I think I'm making progress, something like this happens, and I feel like I'm back at square one. James leaned forward, his eyes soft but filled with conviction. You keep going, because you have to. Because your music isn't just for you, it's for the people who listen, who understand, who feel something when they hear you play. You may not see it now, but there are people out there who need your music, who need you to keep playing. Marcus blinked, surprised by the intensity in James's voice. I'm not saying it's easy, James continued. It's not. But nothing worth doing ever is. You have a gift, Marcus. And if you let people like that woman take it away from you, you're doing a disservice to yourself and to everyone who's ever been moved by your music. The words hit Marcus hard, settling deep in his chest. For the first time that night, a flicker of hope began to stir within him. He had been so consumed by the pain of the moment, by the sting of Claudia's cruel words, that he had forgotten why he played in the first place. It wasn't for recognition or approval. It was for the love of the music, for the way it allowed him to express everything he couldn't put into words. You're right, Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with determination. I can't let them take this from me. James smiled, a small, proud smile. That's right. You've got something special, Marcus. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. For the first time that night, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. The hurt was still there, and it probably always would be. But now, there was something else, a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had started playing in the first place. He wasn't playing for people like Claudia. He was playing for himself, for his community, for anyone who found solace in the sound of his saxophone. And no one, not Claudia, not the wealthy patrons at the bar, not the world, could take that away from him. The following days brought a strange calmness to Marcus. The storm of emotions that had engulfed him after the incident at the bar had not completely dissipated, but thanks to his conversation with James, it felt manageable now. It was as though a fog had lifted just enough for Marcus to see a path forward, however uncertain and narrow that path might be. James's words had resonated with him deeply. There was a fire burning in Marcus that he could no longer deny, a fire fueled by the music that had always been a part of him, and he knew, no matter what, he couldn't give that up. But still, he was left with questions. How could he keep playing in a world where his talent was constantly questioned or undervalued? How could he continue to pour his soul into music when people like Claudia existed, ready to tear him down for no reason other than their own shallow amusement? Marcus had no answers yet, but he knew the first step was to get back to playing. His saxophone was more than an instrument. It was his voice, and it was time he used it again. One evening, Marcus found himself in the old community center where he had first started performing. The building wasn't much to look at, a far cry from the gleaming, polished bar where the incident had occurred, but it had a charm and warmth that Marcus had always found comforting. The walls were adorned with photos of past performers, local musicians who had made their mark in small but meaningful ways. Marcus had played here countless times over the years, for crowds that were always supportive, if modest in size. Tonight the crowd was small but familiar. There were a few regulars, older folks who came to listen to live music, and a handful of young, aspiring musicians. It wasn't a glamorous venue, but here, Marcus was always welcome, always appreciated. He stood on the small stage, tuning his saxophone, trying to shake off the nerves that had crept in since the night at the luxury bar. As he adjusted his reed, a memory from that night flashed across his mind. Claudia's voice, sharp and condescending, calling out to him, treating him like an object for her entertainment. Marcus clenched his jaw, pushing the memory aside. He couldn't let her voice overshadow the music he was about to play. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the first note flow from his saxophone. The room seemed to exhale with him, the soft, melodic sound filling the air. The audience quieted, their attention drawn to the raw emotion in his playing. Marcus had chosen a piece that was close to his heart, a slow, mournful tune that spoke of resilience and hope. As he played, he allowed the music to carry him away, far from the cruelty of that night, far from the doubts that had plagued him since. For those few minutes, everything else melted away. There was no luxury bar, no Claudia, no humiliation. There was only the music, and the way it connected him to the people listening. Here in this small, unassuming space, Marcus felt seen. He felt heard. The music flowed effortlessly, each note a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he could never abandon it. When the final note lingered in the air and slowly faded, the small audience erupted in applause. It wasn't the thunderous ovation of a grand concert hall, but it was genuine, and that meant everything to Marcus. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He had done it. He had reclaimed his music, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward healing. After the performance, Marcus packed up his saxophone, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. As he was getting ready to leave, an older woman approached him. She had been sitting near the front, her eyes closed throughout his performance, clearly savoring every note. Her face was kind, lined with years of life and experience. "That was beautiful," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "You have a real gift, young man. Don't ever forget that." Marcus nodded, grateful for her words. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." "I could feel the emotion in your music," she continued, her eyes locking onto his. "It spoke to me in a way that words never could. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Her words echoed James's, and Marcus felt a surge of validation. He had been searching for something, an affirmation perhaps, that what he was doing mattered. And here it was, handed to him by a stranger, yet it felt more real than any praise he had received in a long time. "Thank you." Marcus repeated, this time with more conviction. I won't. As he walked out of the community center and into the cool night air, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. The world was still the same. People like Claudia would always exist, people who would never see his worth, who would mock or belittle him because of their own insecurities. But there were also people like James, like the woman who had approached him, people who saw beyond the surface, who felt the power of his music. For the first time since that night at the bar, Marcus allowed himself to think about the future. He wasn't going to quit. He couldn't. There was still so much music left in him, so much left to say. But more than that, he was beginning to realize that his music had a purpose beyond himself. It had the power to connect with people, to heal, to inspire. And that was something no amount of prejudice or cruelty could take away. As he walked home, Marcus thought about James's words again. He had been playing for the wrong people, seeking validation from those who would never give it, but now he understood. His music wasn't for them. It was for the people who needed it, the people who felt something when they heard it. With each step, Marcus felt his resolve strengthen. He was going to keep playing, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. His music was his message, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence that. The next few weeks saw Marcus playing more than ever. He threw himself into his music, performing at local venues, small community gatherings, and anywhere that would have him. Each performance brought him closer to his true self, closer to the reason he had started playing in the first place. But one evening, as he was preparing for a performance at a small jazz club, something unexpected happened. Claudia walked in. Marcus's heart skipped a beat when he saw her. She looked different from the last time. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the air of superiority. She was alone this time, her expression softer, almost uncertain. She didn't seem to notice him at first, which was just as well because Marcus wasn't sure how to feel about her being there. A part of him wanted to walk up to her, demand an explanation, or maybe just ignore her entirely. But he didn't. Instead, he turned his attention back to his music, focusing on the performance ahead. The club was small, intimate, with a handful of regulars who appreciated good jazz. As Marcus took the stage and began to play, he tried to forget about Claudia's presence, but it was difficult. He could feel her eyes on him, watching, listening. He didn't know why she was there, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know. But as the night went on, something strange happened. The more Marcus played, the less he cared about her being there. His music took over, as it always did, and soon Claudia faded into the background. She was just another person in the crowd, and for the first time since their encounter, Marcus didn't feel the weight of her judgment pressing down on him. When the set was over, Marcus stepped off the stage, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He had reclaimed his power, his music, and no one, not even Claudia, could take that away from him. As he packed up his saxophone, he noticed Claudia approaching him. "Marcus," she said, her voice hesitant, "can we talk?" Marcus looked at her, unsure of what to say. He had spent so long carrying the weight of her words, the humiliation she had caused him, that he wasn't sure how to respond to her now. But something in her expression gave him pause. She didn't look like the same woman who had taunted him at the bar. There was no arrogance, no cruelty in her eyes. Instead, she looked remorseful. I'm sorry," Claudia said softly. "For what I did, for how I treated you. I was wrong." Marcus blinked, taken aback by her apology. It was the last thing he'd expected. "I don't know why I acted the way I did that night." Claudia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize how hurtful I was. You didn't deserve that." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, processing her words. He could still feel the sting of that night, the humiliation and anger that had consumed him. But standing here now, with Claudia in front of him, something shifted inside him. "I don't need your apology," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "I've already moved past it." Claudia looked down, her expression one of quiet acceptance. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." And with that she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, his heart unexpectedly light. Marcus stood in silence for a moment, watching Claudia walk away. Her apology hung in the air, unexpected and unsettling. He hadn't been sure what to expect from her when she approached, but certainly not this. There had been no grand gesture, no lengthy explanation, just a simple, heartfelt apology. And now she was gone, leaving Marcus to process the conflicting emotions that swirled inside him. On one hand, he wanted to let go of the anger and hurt she had caused. James's words echoed in his mind. Holding on to the pain would only weigh him down. But on the other hand, could he really forgive her? Could a few words of apology erase the humiliation she had caused, the way she had treated him as less than human? As Marcus packed up his saxophone and headed out into the cool night air, he found himself thinking about the nature of forgiveness. It wasn't something that came easily to him, especially when the wound was still fresh. But as he walked, the sound of his own footsteps tapping rhythmically on the sidewalk, he realized that perhaps forgiveness wasn't really about Claudia at all. It was about him. It was about letting go of the power her actions had over him, about freeing himself from the bitterness that had been eating away at him since that night. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive Claudia completely, but for the first time, he was willing to consider it. The days passed uneventfully, and Marcus continued to focus on his music. He threw himself into his performances, each one a little more vibrant, a little more soulful than the last. The hurt from that night at the luxury bar began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus played not just for himself, but for the people who truly appreciated his music. The regulars at the community center, the listeners at the jazz clubs, and even the strangers who stopped to listen when he played on the streets. It was during one such street performance that Marcus encountered Claudia again, though this time the circumstances were different. He was playing in a small park downtown, a place he often visited to clear his mind and connect with his music in its purest form. The park wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, a far cry from the bustling bars and clubs where he usually performed. On this particular afternoon, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. Marcus stood beneath a large oak tree, his saxophone in hand, the soft, lilting melody drifting through the air. A small crowd had gathered, families with children, couples out for an evening stroll, and the occasional passerby who stopped to listen for a moment before moving on. It wasn't a formal performance, but Marcus didn't care. Here, in the open air, he could play without the pressure of an audience's expectations. As he played, Marcus noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Claudia. She was dressed more casually than the last time he had seen her. No designer clothes, no expensive accessories. She stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, watching him with an expression that was hard to read. For a moment, Marcus considered stopping, but something inside him told him to keep playing. He didn't know why she was there, but he wasn't going to let her presence derail his performance. Instead, he focused on the music, letting the notes carry him away, just as they always did. As the last note faded into the evening air, the small crowd applauded softly, a gentle acknowledgement of the beauty they had just witnessed. Marcus nodded in appreciation, but his eyes were drawn to Claudia, who remained standing at the edge of the crowd, her gaze fixed on him. Slowly, she approached. "Marcus," she said softly when she was close enough to be heard. There was a hesitance in her voice, as though she wasn't sure if she had the right to speak to him. I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," Marcus replied, his voice neutral. He wasn't sure what else to say. There was still a part of him that bristled at her presence, but another part of him was curious. Why had she come? What did she want? Claudia hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and about what I said to you that night." She glanced down at the ground, clearly uncomfortable. "I know I already apologized, but I feel like I owe you more than that. I owe you an explanation." Marcus didn't say anything, but he nodded slightly, indicating that she could continue. Claudia looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had approached. There was a vulnerability in her expression that Marcus hadn't seen before, a rawness that seemed at odds with the confident, sharp-tongued woman he had met that night at the bar. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who only care about money, status, and appearances," Claudia began, her voice quiet but steady. It's a world where people are judged by what they have, not who they are. And I've been a part of that world for so long that I didn't even realize how toxic it was. Marcus listened, his curiosity growing. He had never expected Claudia to open up like this, to expose her own flaws and insecurities. There was a part of him that wanted to dismiss her words, to walk away and leave her standing there, but another part of him, perhaps the part that James had nurtured in him, wanted to hear her out. That night at the bar, Claudia continued, her voice thick with emotion. I wasn't really mocking you. I mean, I was, but I was also mocking myself. I was so angry, so frustrated with my own life, and I took it out on you. It was wrong. I've spent so much time hiding behind my wealth and my status, pretending that everything was fine. But the truth is, I've been miserable for a long time. Marcus didn't know what to say. He had expected her apology to be shallow, perhaps insincere. But this was something else entirely. Claudia wasn't just apologizing, she was confessing. She was bearing her soul in a way that was both unexpected and, in a strange way, courageous. I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy, Claudia added quickly, as though reading his thoughts. I know what I did was terrible, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that it wasn't about you, it was about me and my own messed up life. For a long moment, there was silence between them. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving Marcus and Claudia standing alone beneath the oak tree. Marcus considered her words carefully. He wasn't sure what to make of them, wasn't sure if he could fully believe her. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she had opened up to him, that felt genuine. I appreciate your honesty, Marcus said finally, his voice measured. And I believe you when you say it wasn't about me. But that doesn't change the fact that what you did hurt me. It's going to take time for me to get past that. Claudia nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I know. I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I wanted you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. Marcus watched her for a moment, then sighed softly. We all are, I guess. Claudia smiled faintly, though there was still a sadness in her eyes. Yeah, I suppose we are. For a long moment they stood there in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Then, without another word, Claudia turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone beneath the tree. That night, Marcus found himself thinking about Claudia's words. She had been vulnerable with him in a way that he hadn't expected, and while he wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive her, he couldn't deny that her apology had shifted something inside him. James had always told him that forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about freeing yourself from the pain they had caused. And maybe that was true. Maybe in time, Marcus would be able to let go of the hurt and the anger that had been weighing him down. But for now, he was content with the knowledge that he had moved on, that his music was still his, untouched by the cruelty of others. He had reclaimed his voice, and that was enough. The days following Claudia's second apology were strange for Marcus. He found himself thinking about her more often than he wanted to admit. It wasn't that he was obsessed with her or what she had done to him. Those feelings of anger and humiliation had begun to fade, but rather, he was intrigued by the shift in her demeanor. Claudia had revealed a side of herself that Marcus hadn't anticipated, and it left him questioning whether people like her could really change. Marcus had never considered himself a person quick to forgive, but he also wasn't someone who clung to grudges. Growing up, his mother had always told him that anger was a fire that could consume a person if they let it. She had lived through her own share of injustices, but she had taught Marcus to rise above it, to keep moving forward no matter what. Now, as an adult, those lessons rang clearer than ever. James had echoed that sentiment. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's actions, but about letting go of the pain they caused. And Claudia had done something Marcus wasn't sure she was capable of. She had taken responsibility for her actions. She had shown vulnerability. She had exposed herself in a way that, ironically, made her seem more human than the cold, wealthy woman he had once assumed she was. But even with all this in mind, Marcus knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It was a process, one that would take time. And in the meantime, there was one thing that remained constant in his life: his music. One evening, about 2 weeks after his encounter with Claudia in the park, Marcus was invited to play at a small but well-known jazz club that catered to an eclectic crowd of both regulars and tourists. The club had been a staple in the city for years, a place where new musicians could make a name for themselves and seasoned performers could reconnect with their roots. For Marcus, it was a venue he had long admired but never had the opportunity to play at. Until now. The night felt special. The club was packed, the low hum of conversation filling the space, but the atmosphere was relaxed. People came here to listen to music, to lose themselves in the sound, not to judge or critique. As Marcus stood backstage, preparing his saxophone, he felt a nervous excitement building in his chest. It had been a while since he had performed in a venue like this, where the crowd truly came to hear the music, not just for a night out. James had come to support him, sitting at a table near the front with a couple of other musicians Marcus knew from around the local scene. It was a comfort to know his mentor was there, quietly cheering him on. Marcus could see the pride in James's eyes, and that meant more to him than any applause or accolades could. As Marcus took the stage, the lights dimmed, and the soft glow of candles on the tables illuminated the faces in the crowd. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the first note flow from his saxophone. The room fell into a hushed silence, every ear attuned to the sound. The music came easily to Marcus tonight. His fingers moved fluidly over the keys, each note resonating with the depth of emotion he had carried with him for weeks. It was as if every doubt, every hurt, and every small victory was pouring out of him through the music. He played not just for himself, but for every person who had ever felt overlooked, every person who had ever been judged unfairly, and for every person who had ever questioned their own worth. The crowd was entranced. Marcus could feel their energy, their connection to the music. It was a rare and beautiful thing, this shared experience between performer and audience. As the final notes of his set faded into the air, the room erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of casual listeners, but the genuine appreciation of people who had been moved by what they had heard. Marcus smiled, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. He had played from his heart tonight, and it had reached people. That was all he had ever wanted. After the set, Marcus made his way to James's table, where his mentor greeted him with a wide grin. "You were incredible tonight," James said, his voice filled with pride. "I could feel every note." "Thanks, James," Marcus replied, feeling a warmth spread through him. It felt good, real good. They chatted for a while, sharing stories and laughs, when Marcus noticed someone standing at the edge of the room, hesitating near the door. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized her, Claudia. She was dressed simply again, her usual air of wealth and status subdued. She stood there, watching him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. It was clear she hadn't expected to be noticed, but now that Marcus had seen her, she had no choice but to step forward. James glanced at Marcus, then at Claudia, and gave Marcus a small nod, signaling that he would leave them alone. He excused himself from the table, giving Marcus a reassuring pat on the back as he walked away. Claudia approached cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate. When she reached the table, she spoke softly, almost as if she were afraid of disrupting the moment. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, her voice tentative. Marcus studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her intentions. She had come to listen, not to mock or belittle, and that in itself was significant. "You're not intruding," Marcus said, gesturing for her to sit. Claudia sat down across from him, her eyes downcast for a moment before she finally looked up. "I came to hear you play," she admitted. "I heard you were performing tonight, and I wanted to understand what I couldn't see before." Marcus didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what she was looking for: absolution, understanding, or perhaps just a glimpse into a world she had never taken the time to appreciate. "I'm glad you came," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "But understand this. It's not my job to help you understand. You have to figure that out on your own." Claudia nodded, her expression one of quiet acceptance. "I know. I'm not asking for anything from you. I wanted to be here. I wanted to listen." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the club fading into the background. It was a strange moment, this quiet truce between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt oddly peaceful. Marcus could see now that Claudia wasn't the same person she had been that night at the bar. Something in her had shifted, just as something had shifted in him. "I'm not looking for your forgiveness," Claudia said softly after a long pause. "I don't expect it. But I needed to be here tonight to see you play, to understand what I didn't before." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering her words. There was no bitterness left in him, no anger. What had once been a deep wound was now just a faint scar, a reminder of what had happened but no longer something that held power over him. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," Marcus said honestly. "But I'm not angry anymore, and that's enough for me, for now." Claudia nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "That's more than I could ask for." For the first time since that night, Marcus felt a sense of closure. He didn't need Claudia's apology, and he didn't need to forgive her right away. What mattered was that he had reclaimed his voice, his dignity, and his purpose. He had moved past the pain, not by holding on to it, but by letting it go. As the night wore on, the two sat there, not as enemies or strangers, but as two people who had come to understand something about themselves and about each other. Marcus knew that life would continue to present its challenges, that there would always be people like Claudia who would misunderstand or mistreat him. But he also knew that his music, his passion, was stronger than any of that. It had the power to connect, to heal, and to transcend the barriers that divided people. And as long as he had that, nothing else mattered. In the end, it wasn't about Claudia or the people who judged him. It was about Marcus and his journey, his resilience, and his ability to rise above the pain and keep playing. His music was his voice, and he would never let anyone take that from him again. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.